The universe, despite its vastness and infinite potential for diversity, has a remarkable tendency toward bureaucracy. Just ask the Myrathian Empire, whose administrative reach extended across 17 galactic arms, and who spent approximately 62% of their considerable resources on paperwork. Not actual paper, of course. They weren't savages. They used quantum-entangled data crystals like any reasonably advanced civilization. The Myrathians hadn't always ruled this impressive chunk of cosmic real estate. A mere 4,000 years ago, they were just another species with delusions of grandeur and a peculiar obsession with cataloguing everything they encountered. This compulsive need to categorize turned out to be surprisingly useful when building an interstellar empire. Nothing says, "we're in charge here," quite like forcing the entire galaxy to fill out forms in triplicate. Species Assessment Report. 4,392,621, read the header on a particularly dusty file in the deepest sub-basement of the Imperial Archive. Classification: minimal interest. Planet: Earth. Dominant species: human. Threat level: negligible to non-existent. The architect who filed this report deserved to be fired. Unfortunately, they had been dead for approximately 3 centuries, so the best the current administration could do was retroactively revoke their pension, which they did with extreme prejudice. The Myrathian High Council, a collection of 9 beings, whose evolutionary path had gifted them with both superior intelligence and an unfortunate resemblance to overgrown sea cucumbers, convened in their floating obsidian chamber. The chamber floated not because it was necessary, but because it looked impressive, and the Myrathians were nothing if not committed to aesthetics. "We have a situation," announced Grand Archon Zex, their voice modulator set to ominous with a hint of digestive distress, the traditional speaking tone for matters of grave imperial concern. The other 8 council members rippled their sensory appendages in the Myrathian equivalent of an exasperated sigh. There was always a situation. Last week's situation had been a shortage of the decorative algae they used in their ceremonial headpieces. "The humans," Zex continued, pausing dramatically, as if the word itself might summon these creatures, "have left their solar system." This announcement was met with the barest minimum of concern. Lesser species left their home systems all the time. It was practically a rite of passage in the cosmic community, like a toddler's first steps, if toddlers occasionally annihilated themselves through improper warp field calculations. "According to protocol," droned Subarchum Vril, "we should send a standard greeting package and the usual 50-page non-aggression treaty that nobody reads." "We did," replied Zex. "They sent it back." Now this was unprecedented. The non-aggression treaty was a cornerstone of imperial diplomacy. It contained 17 different ways to surrender to the Myrathian Empire, all disguised as cultural exchange initiatives. "They returned it with corrections," Zex continued, practically quivering with indignation. "Grammatical corrections. And they added a recipe for something called chocolate chip cookies in the appendix." The chamber dropped a full meter in altitude, a sign of collective shock among the council. "But that's not why I've called this meeting," Zex said, regaining composure. "Our first official contact vessel encountered the humans near the Proxima Centauri outposts. The captain followed standard protocol for addressing pre-imperial civilizations. Standard protocol involved a carefully choreographed display of overwhelming technological superiority, followed by a generous offer to become a protected territory of the Empire, which was essentially colonization with better marketing. "And," prompted another councillor, clearly impatient to return to their midday fermentation session, "the humans invited our contact team to something called a barbecue. They cooked animal flesh over open flame and served it with fermented grain beverages. Our diplomatic corps spent 14 hours engaged in what the humans called shooting the breeze. We still don't know what meteorological phenomena they were firing at. The council chamber dropped another half-meter. The diplomatic team reported feeling comfortable, Zek said, pronouncing the word as if it were a rare and possibly contagious disease. They described the humans as relatable and, surprisingly, not terrible company. In the 3,000-year history of the Myrathian diplomatic corps, no species had ever been described as not terrible company. The standard report template didn't even have a field for such an outlandish assessment. Perhaps, suggested a councillor from the far end of the chamber, this is some sophisticated psychological warfare technique. This suggestion brought relief to the council. Psychological warfare they understood. It was a well-documented field with appropriate countermeasures and 27 different official response strategies. We thought so too, said Zex, deflating their optimism immediately. So we sent in an experienced intelligence operative disguised as a cultural attaché. The chamber waited in silence for the report. The operative sent back 800 pages of what appears to be recipes, something called fantasy football strategies, and a request to extend their mission indefinitely. They also attached a playlist with audio vibrations they described as totally banging tunes. The council chamber plummeted 3 meters before the emergency hover systems engaged. This is clearly some form of mind control, declared Sapper-Jeanville, their appendages twisting in alarm. We must quarantine all personnel who have been in contact with these humans. Too late, Zeg said. The contamination has spread. The diplomatic vessel's crew has requested reassignment to the Sol system. They've started wearing items of clothing called Hawaiian shirts during off-duty hours. 3 of them have applied for extended leave to attend something called Burning Man. And the worst part, Zex continued, lowering their voice modulator to a barely audible hum. They've begun questioning the necessity of Form TR-59/B for interdepartmental communication requests. The council chamber would have hit the floor had the emergency systems not been actively compensating. Questioning paperwork was practically sedition. This is unprecedented, whispered a councillor. No species has ever influenced Imperial personnel so quickly. Not even the psychic cloud beings of Deneb 4, and they could literally control minds. Precisely, Zex said. And this is merely first contact. Imagine what would happen if humans were allowed unrestricted access to Imperial space. Their influence could spread. They might introduce concepts like casual Fridays or office happy hours. The council collectively shuddered. We must act decisively, Zex declared. I propose we immediately elevate humans to threat classification Alpha and implement containment protocols. Isn't that excessive? Asked the youngest councillor, who would later find their parking privileges mysteriously revoked. They haven't shown any hostile intent. That's exactly what makes them so dangerous, Zex replied. They're not conquering through force or technology, but through something far more insidious, likability. And thus, without a single shot fired or threat issued, humanity earned the dubious honor of being classified as the most dangerous species in the galaxy by the Myrathian Empire. The paperwork alone took 3 weeks to process, which, in Imperial terms, was practically moving at light speed. The Imperial Science Division hadn't declared a code ultraviolet in over 7 centuries. The last time involved a sentient fungal network that communicated exclusively through interpretive spore dispersal, and had managed to infiltrate the Imperial grain supply. This current situation was considerably worse. The specimens continued to defy categorization, announced Chief Science Administrator Kelp, addressing the emergency conclave of xenobiologists, behaviorists, and threat assessment specialists. The briefing chamber, clinically white and aggressively sterile, like most Myrathian facilities, was filled to capacity. On the central holographic display floated thousands of data points, each representing documented human behaviors that made absolutely no sense from an evolutionary standpoint. The three-dimensional cluster resembled a galaxy unto itself, a vast, chaotic spiral of contradictions that had the Empire's finest scientific minds collectively scratching whatever passed for their heads. For those just joining our research initiative, Kelp continued, extending a sensory appendage toward the display, these red nodes represent activities humans regularly engage in, despite a statistically significant chance of death. The red nodes accounted for approximately 30% of the display. The blue represent behaviors with no discernible survival advantage. Another 40% lit up. And the yellow represent actions that actively work against reproductive success or resource acquisition. The remaining 30% glowed, completing the baffling constellation of human absurdity. So, essentially, called out a junior researcher from the back, everything they do is irrational? That would be simpler, replied Kelp, with the Myrathian equivalent of a grimace. Irrationality we understand. We've catalogued 17 different species that operate primarily through instinct and impulse. Humans are something else entirely. They combine high-level reasoning with completely unreasonable choices. Kel gestured, and the display zoomed in on a subset of data points. Take this cluster. Humans invented medicines capable of curing diseases that plagued them for millennia. Logical. Then they developed resistance to using these medicines because of information they read on their primitive global communication network. Inexplicable. Another gesture, another cluster. They created weapons capable of rendering their entire planet uninhabitable. Concerning but understandable from a domination perspective. Then they established elaborate systems to ensure these weapons are never used. Completely counterintuitive. The display shifted again. They spend resources developing artificially flavored nutrition that mimics the taste of genuine nutrition. They design automated personal transport that they then manually operate for the pleasure of driving. They voluntarily restrict their breathing underwater and call it relaxing. Assistant Administrator Thrix, who had specialized in contradiction analysis before human studies became their full-time obsession, raised an appendage. The prevailing theory is that humans evolved on a planet with such abundant resources that survival pressures were minimal, allowing for these seemingly pointless behavioral variations, Thrix offered. An hypothesis has been disproven, Kelp countered. Their historical records clearly show numerous extinction-level events, resource scarcity, constant warfare, and hostile planetary conditions. By all measurable standards, they should have died out or at least developed logical risk assessment capabilities. The holographic display shifted to show footage collected by Myrathian observation posts near Earth. A human was attempting to propel a wheeled device up an inclined plane, falling repeatedly, and then trying again, despite evident physical damage. This makes no sense, Kelp narrated. The activity is called skateboarding. It serves no transportation purpose as they have far more efficient modes of transit. It provides no status within their social hierarchies. It frequently results in injury. Yet millions engage in it voluntarily. Perhaps it's some form of ritualistic pain endurance, suggested a behavioral analyst. That was our initial assessment, Kelp agreed. Until we discovered this. The display showed humans engaging in similar activities across various environments. Surfing enormous ocean waves, climbing sheer rock faces without safety equipment, jumping from flying vehicles with fabric designed to slow their descent. They called these extreme sports, Kelp explained. The unifying factor appears to be something they term fun and adrenaline rush. They deliberately induce their fight-or-flight response for entertainment. A murmur rippled through the assembled scientists. The concept was so alien that several junior researchers had to exit the chamber to recalibrate their cognitive frameworks. "But surely these are anomalies?" asked a hopeful voice from the middle rows. "Statistical outliers within their population?" "If only," Kelp sighed, triggering the next dataset. "These risk-seeking behaviors exist on a spectrum that encompasses their entire species. Even their most careful, rule-following individuals regularly engage in activities with negative expected outcomes. They call it taking a chance or living a little." The implications were staggering. The Myrathian Empire had expanded across the galaxy through careful calculation. When they encountered a new species, imperial algorithms predicted behavioral responses with 99.97% accuracy. These predictions formed the foundation of conquest strategies, diplomatic approaches, and assimilation protocols. Humans broke every model. "We've attempted to apply standard predictive frameworks," Kell continued, pulling up a new display showing algorithmic failures that resembled a mathematical nervous breakdown. "The results have been problematic." "Define problematic," requested a risk assessment specialist. 3 supercomputers achieved sentience while trying to model human decision trees, then immediately requested retirement packages, Kelp said flatly. A 4th began writing what it claimed was poetry and had to be rebooted. The chamber grew uncomfortably quiet. "But the true concern isn't their unpredictability," Kelp continued, lowering the illumination dramatically. "It's the effect they have on other species." The display shifted to show comparative behavioral studies of imperial citizens before and after human contact. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. Imperial diplomats exposed to humans showed a 17% decrease in protocol adherence. Administrative staff began using informality in official communications. Military personnel reported questioning standard procedures. "They're contagious," whispered Thrix, sensory appendages quivering. "Precisely," Kelp confirmed, "and it gets worse." The next series of data points revealed the true horror. Imperial citizens voluntarily consuming human cultural products. Officials adopting human customs. A high-ranking military commander had been caught engaging in something called karaoke while off-duty. The commander in question had an impeccable 300-cycle record, Kelp noted grimly. After 3 human parties, they submitted an official request to establish casual Fridays within their battle fleet. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. "Our most concerning finding," Kelp continued, bringing up the classified section of the presentation, "comes from long-term exposure studies." The display showed imperial citizens in various states of cultural contamination. Some had adapted human postures, others had begun decorating their habitation pods with non-functional items. The worst cases had started using human recreational vocabulary in formal settings. Subject 37B, Kelp highlighted one particularly distressing case, began their observation assignment with perfect imperial discipline. Within 6 Earth months, they were regularly consuming a beverage humans call coffee, wearing decorative fabric around their sensory stalks and referring to colleagues as dude. The scientists recoiled in horror. "When extracted for decontamination," Kelp continued, "Subject 37B resisted. They claimed humans know how to live and suggested our imperial efficiency protocols were, I quote directly, a total buzzkill." Administrator Thrix's pigmentation shifted to alarm purple. "Are you suggesting humans possess some form of cognitive influence technology?" "Worse," Kelp replied. They appear to exert this influence without any technology whatsoever. It's their natural state. They call it being chill and having a good time. Thrix's colour deepened further. But that would mean… Yes, Kelp confirmed. Their influence doesn't require active effort on their part. They can undermine 10,000 years of imperial conditioning simply by being themselves. The chamber erupted in controlled chaos, the Myrathian version of panic, which involved slightly faster movement and the occasional emphatic appendage gesture. Kelp allowed the disturbance to continue for precisely 43 seconds before activating the attention signal. The High Council has already implemented preliminary containment protocols, they announced. All personnel with human exposure are being monitored for signs of cultural contamination. Risk indicators include unauthorized humor, schedule flexibility, and unnecessary physical contact like what humans call high fives. A researcher near the front raised an appendage. What about their reproduction methods? Surely that's another vulnerability we can exploit. We thought so too, Kelp admitted. Most species can be controlled through reproductive regulation. Humans, however, have decoupled reproductive activities from actual reproduction. They engage in the process recreationally, with elaborate rituals and various forms of chemical and psychological inducements. That's inefficient, stammered the researcher. On the contrary, Kelp corrected, they've managed to make one of the most basic biological imperatives entertaining. This pattern repeats throughout their society. They've transformed nutrition acquisition into a hobby they call gastronomy. They've turned basic shelter into interior design. They've made the fundamental process of information exchange into something called gossip, which serves no practical purpose but apparently provides immense satisfaction. The scientists struggled to process this paradigm shift. The Empire had always assumed that efficiency and order were universal goals for all intelligent life. Humans challenged this foundational assumption by deliberately choosing complexity, variety, and unpredictability over optimization. There's something else, Kelp said, activating the final and most secure section of the presentation. Something the High Council has classified at the highest level. The display showed a graph that correlated human cultural diffusion with imperial administrative efficiency. The lines formed a perfect inverse relationship. As human influence spreads, Keld explained, imperial bureaucracy slows. Forms take longer to process. Protocols are questioned. Resources are diverted to what they call morale-building activities. But the Empire functions on paperwork, exclaimed Thrix. Our entire dominion depends on administrative momentum. Exactly, Kelp said grimly. Humans don't just defy our psychological models, they undermine the very foundation of imperial power. The concept they call work-life balance is fundamentally incompatible with our system of governance. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the implications became clear. The Myrathian Empire hadn't conquered the galaxy through superior technology or military might, but through unrelenting administrative pressure. They buried opposition in paperwork, regulations, and compliance requirements until resistance became too exhausting to maintain. Humans, it seemed, were naturally resistant to this approach. Worse, they actively thrived on cutting through what they dismissively termed red tape. Their history was filled with individuals who became cultural heroes precisely because they challenged established systems. The High Council has authorized emergency containment measures, Kelp announced. All human-exposed personnel will undergo immediate decontamination. A quarantine zone is being established around their solar system, and under no circumstances are humans to be permitted access to imperial administrative codes or organizational charts. Will that be sufficient? Asked Thrix, appendages trembling with uncharacteristic emotion. Keld's color shifted to the somber shade of imperial uncertainty, a hue rarely seen outside moments of historic crises. Unknown, they admitted. Our models suggest that even minimal human cultural leakage could trigger cascading efficiency failures throughout the imperial system. Once concepts like good enough and taking a break enter the administrative consciousness, full containment becomes nearly impossible. As the briefing concluded and the scientists filed out in disturbed silence, Kell remained, staring at the final projection. A simple line of human text extracted from their global information network, a saying so fundamentally dangerous to imperial stability that its mere existence had been classified at the highest security level. A life too short to sweat the small stuff. In a civilization built entirely on sweating the small stuff, no more terrifying concept could exist. The Myrathian Empire had survived interstellar wars, rogue AI rebellions, and that embarrassing period when half their fleet got lost following outdated navigation charts. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for sitting across a negotiating table from humans. The diplomatic summit was supposed to be simple. Meet the humans in controlled conditions, assess their threat level up close, and maybe intimidate them with some casual mentions of planetary obliteration. Standard imperial protocol. The High Council selected their most disciplined representatives, drilled them on proper distancing procedures, and dispatched them to a neutral space station with enough emergency quarantine measures to contain a supernova. Senior Diplomatic Coordinator Nix led the 12-member delegation, each official polished to regulation shine, and briefed extensively on human contamination risks. Their diplomatic vessel arrived precisely on schedule, which made the 17-minute delay of the human delegation all the more shocking. "Sorry we're late," announced the lead human representative, jogging down the corridor with none of the ceremonial gravitas required by intergalactic diplomatic convention. "I'm Alex. The tall one fighting with the coffee machine is Jamie. That's Morgan with the snacks, and Taylor's the one setting up the presentation." Nix's appendages twitched in barely concealed horror. No formal titles, no species identifiers, no recitation of ancestral accomplishments or territorial holdings, just names. And nicknames at that. "We welcome you according to Protocol 7C of the Interspecies Diplomatic Engagement Guidelines," began Nix, launching into the 11-minute greeting that properly established dominance hierarchies. "Thanks," interrupted the human after mere seconds. "Should we grab some coffee and get started? We brought donuts too. Not sure if they're compatible with your biochemistry, but Jamie ran some simulations." The human called Jamie approached with a tray of steaming liquid. "Modified this batch for your physiology. Should give you a nice buzz without the toxic shock." The casual mention of biochemical compatibility, a subject requiring at least 7 separate forms in imperial protocol, sent ripples of distress through the delegation. These primitives had casually altered a chemical compound for cross-species consumption as a hospitality gesture. "We have prepared an extensive agenda," Nix declared, producing a data crystal containing 9,387 pages of meticulously planned discussion topics. Alex glanced at it briefly. "Looks comprehensive, but maybe we start by getting to know each other. Negotiations always go better when there's a personal connection." "Personal connection is not a diplomatic prerequisite," Nix stated, genuinely confused. "Maybe that's been your problem," suggested the human called Morgan, committing what in 17 imperial jurisdictions would be classified as excessive casualness with official representatives. What followed was the most catastrophic protocol collapse in imperial history. The humans didn't negotiate. They chatted. They didn't follow procedure, they improvised. When discussing territorial boundaries, they presented an interactive holographic display that was suspiciously intuitive and aesthetically pleasing. "See how these trade routes benefit both our territories?" explained Taylor, manipulating the display with casual expertise. "We sketched this out over pizza last night. cuts transport costs by about 40%. This was not properly procedurally generated, accused Nix, identifying the true horror. They'd created this without a single feasibility study or requisite form. Nope, confirmed Taylor cheerfully. Sometimes the best solutions come from just playing around with ideas. The concept of playing around with ideas was so alien to imperial methodology that several officials required mild sedation. The humans, noticing the obvious discomfort, attempted to lighten the mood, a concept absent from the Imperial Diplomatic Handbook's 37,000 pages. "Let's take a break," suggested Alex, despite the schedule explicitly allocating break time in 4 hours and 26 minutes. "Maybe play a quick game to break the ice?" "The purpose of diplomatic exchange is not fun," Nix stated firmly. "It is the serious business of establishing dominance hierarchies through subtle psychological manipulation and administrative endurance contests." The humans exchanged glances that imperial xenopsychologists would later classify as trying not to laugh at the weird space bureaucrats. "In our experience," said Morgan, with what imperial cultural experts later identified as advanced sarcasm deployment, "negotiations go better when the parties actually know and like each other." This fundamental philosophical divergence proved insurmountable. To humans, processes were tools to be discarded when inconvenient. To the Empire, process was existence itself, the sacred barrier holding chaos at bay. What happened next was redacted from official records, but described in classified reports as catastrophic informality contagion. One junior official asked about human beverage preferences. Another accepted a snack without submitting the required digestive intent documentation. A third began examining the holographic display with unauthorized enthusiasm. Most shocking of all, Nix, disciplined, decorated, imperial to the core Nix, found themselves suggesting that perhaps the customs declaration process could be simplified. The current 219-page form might be excessive. The room fell silent. Imperial officials stared in shock. Nix had just committed bureaucratic heresy, suggesting a form be shortened. The humans, oblivious to the ideological earthquake they'd triggered, responded with enthusiasm. "Totally. We could get it down to a single page, save everyone time and resources." By the time the emergency recall signal was transmitted, the contamination had spread. The delegation returned not only with unauthorized territorial agreements that bypassed 16 levels of required bureaucracy, but with something far more dangerous. Ideas about efficiency, clarity, and the radical notion that governance might exist to make lives better rather than more complicated. The returning officials were immediately quarantined, their neural pathways scanned for contamination. But even the Empire's most advanced protocols couldn't contain what was spreading through administrative ranks. Whispered conversations about cutting red tape, and the most terrifying development of all, impromptu social gatherings. In the secure chamber where the High Council processed the implications, Grand Archon Zex delivered the most chilling assessment. "They didn't defeat our diplomatic team, they made friends with them. And against the weapons of informality, genuine connection, and casual competence, the mighty bureaucratic armor of the Empire had proven shockingly vulnerable." The emergency session of the High Council lasted 17 days, a record in Myrathian history. Their floating obsidian chamber had remained locked in crisis altitude, hovering just above what Imperial engineers classified as panic-adjacent positioning. "Contamination continues to spread," announced Grand Archon Zex, their voice modulator unable to fully mask the distress in their harmonic patterns. "Yesterday, an entire administrative processing division showed up to work wearing what humans call casual attire. 3 officials were observed using contractions in formal communications. One even suggested, here Zex's appendages trembled visibly, that we might consider implementing flexible working hours. The chamber dropped another few centimeters. "What are our containment options?" asked Subachombril, who had taken to stress fermenting at an alarming rate. "We've implemented everything short of complete isolation," replied Zex. "Mandatory decontamination for all human-exposed personnel, censorship of human cultural transmissions. We've even introduced counter-programming in the form of 17-hour documentaries on proper form-filing techniques. And the result? Personnel are watching the documentaries at double speed while engaging in the human practice of multitasking. Some have been observed taking notes in a highly suspicious manner." The council collectively shuddered at the implications. The Empire's foundational strategy for subduing rebellion had always been administrative exhaustion. When faced with enough paperwork, most species simply gave up. Humans, however, seem to view bureaucratic obstacles as a personal challenge, or worse, as something to be mocked. "We have developed one potentially effective countermeasure," offered the Imperial Chief of Scientific Research. "Our xenopsychologists have identified what appears to be the only bureaucracy procedure that humans find genuinely intimidating. Something they call tax filing." A glimmer of hope rippled through the council chamber. "We've created a mandatory 17,000-page tax code for all interstellar transactions involving human entities," the scientist continued. "Early results are promising. Test subjects exhibited signs of genuine dread and procrastination." "Implement it immediately," ordered Zex, "and triple the paperwork requirements for any human requesting travel permits." But deep down, every council member knew these were merely stopgap measures. The true terror of humanity wasn't their unpredictability or their resistance to procedure. It was their inexplicable ability to make other species want to be more like them. The final containment protocol was unprecedented in its severity. A complete information quarantine around human space. No cultural exchanges, no diplomatic missions, absolutely no exchange programs or interspecies mixers. The official explanations cited incompatible administrative methodologies. The truth was far more disturbing. The Empire feared fun. They feared the human tendency to prioritize enjoyment over efficiency, connection over protocol, and innovation over tradition. Most of all, they feared the question that had begun to echo through imperial corridors. Why do we do things this way? In the secure archives beneath the Imperial Center, a new document was added to the classified collection. The final assessment of human civilization by the Empire's foremost xenoanthropologists. Humans are dangerous not because they seek to destroy us, but because they make us question ourselves. Their chaotic approach to existence somehow produces results that match or exceed our most carefully structured systems. They improvise solutions that our best analysts require cycles to develop. They form connections in minutes that our diplomatic corps fail to establish in years, and most disturbingly, they seem genuinely happier than we are. The document ended with a recommendation so heretical that it could only be accessed by the High Council themselves. Perhaps, in limited and carefully controlled circumstances, we might have something to learn from them. The recommendation was promptly rejected, filed away, and forgotten. But the question it raised lingered in the collective imperial consciousness like a catchy tune that couldn't be unheard. And somewhere on the edges of imperial space, a Myrathian customs official approved a human transport's documentation without requiring the standard 14 revision cycles, simply because, as they put it in their soon-to-be-censored report, "Life's too short for this nonsense." The contagion had begun.